you actually help build the capacity so that doesn't happen yet. It's just like when you get the districts that we document in our exemplars that are way heavy on the support side, right? So it's all about a conversation. Let's just keep talking, and we'll just keep talking, right? So we think it's really important to figure out what is the appropriate balance as both the commission and the state contemplates how to provide this monitoring and reporting support to school districts to hold intention, accountability, and support. And that's really the essence of that second bullet. In terms of the long-term, kind of first recommendation, develop an appropriate and effective combination of sanctions and supports. I'm not going to go into any further detail, but just continuing to mature that as we move along. And then the second around creating and implementing a stepped approach to increasingly intense consequences of both sanction and support, starting with the first year of implementation, right? So not going from 0 to 100, right? When somebody doesn't meet the mark, but how do you think about collectively as a community developing that step stair of support to systems? And we would also say to really contemplate that on the back end, you're not cutting off the support immediately, right? So once they hit it, you're just like totally withdrawing any kind of support that you're offering to the district or school, because it creates in some ways a cliff in a whole variety of ways, from a capacity, funding, and implementation level as well. So that will conclude our presentation. That
I'm sorry,
there's a lot in there, but
we have a gentleman here from Schoolnomics that I wanted to actually change the order of the agenda if I could, and have him come up and speak. And we may not, if there isn't enough time, we see you guys every meeting.
that's true. Yes, that's true. Yes.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So if we could close this particular item. And so this is item number 6, and we're going to move to item number 8. Or I'm sorry, we're going to move to item number 9, presentation regarding inside data collection requirements and reporting. And we have Mr. Rick Wells here from Schoolnomics.
There we go. I can see it, but you can't see it.
It's not connected, maybe. One, two, good one.
It's not.
Let's do it.
I have been postponed on
Oh,
I was gonna say I have to hang right now. So if you can't figure it out, we have it.
You have it, okay. Well,
Yeah,
just go
just tell
through.
us what slide you're on when you go.
All right. All right, so I was asked to present information to you about Insight. Now, some of you, I think, are you familiar with Insight? Yeah, I thought possibly some of you were. I moved to slide 2. In Nevada and Insight, this has been a 20-year partnership, more than 20 years now. We have been doing the financial accountability data work since 1998, producing what's called the accountability report card, and also producing searchable databases that we provide to our contractors, actually with the LCB, but it's provided to the NDE as well. Moving to the next one, what is Insight? Insight is a patented activity-based costing model that analyzes education expenditures. It was created back in the 90s by PricewaterhouseCoopers and the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. We bought it in 2001. So what does Insight do? It analyzes every expenditure that a school district has. The major categories being the personnel costs, of course, purchase services like legal, nurses, therapists, supplies and equipment, textbooks, computers, energy, fuel, and then what we call other costs, which are more capital items and the debt service items. So they each get segregated. What was Insight designed to do? It was designed to deal with incomparable data. The challenge is that the personnel system, I think I heard this a bit ago, are not the same across all of the individual districts and charter schools. Everybody has their own way of doing things. So there's different methods of grouping and categorizing data that makes the comparisons difficult. Our job is to level that playing field a little bit. So we map them to what we call the Insight functions. They're functions very similar to the ones that are in your chart of accounts, and into programs. And then we used a numerous number of cost allocation methods. When we get done with it, it's comparable and consistent across the whole state. The Insight data views are basically, as I mentioned, functions, which are also known as activities, programs, purpose or objective, and then the education level. So we'll actually do the analysis by school types. So elementaries, you can compare to elementaries, middle to middle, high to high. The reporting levels, it rolls up from the bottom, from the schools to the district to the state. And we do report per pupil for all reporting levels in all of our charts. And there's reports and charts provided, as well as the searchable database that I mentioned before. Moving to the next one, the reporting dimensions in function. Like I said, these are the purpose or the activity for which the resources were expended. Okay, so if you look at some of the categories, we're looking at the direct instruction of students, the cost relative to supporting students, the instructional staff support, operations of the district, the non-operating costs like the capital and debt. And then finally, we call leadership, the school and district management. Moving ahead. These are the major accountability functions. And it's a hierarchy that starts at the top and moves down. So in the instruction category, I won't go through all of these, but just to give you an idea, we break instruction down into various components. The major one is face-to-face teaching, which includes teachers, substitutes, and paraprofessionals, materials, and things like that. The leadership, it has the school management programs and the district management. Operations, of course, is your facilities, your business operations, the non-instructional services that are provided. And instruction support is basically support for pupils, teachers, and programs. Moving to the next one. This is just a chart that came from the last year's report. That is a comparison of the functional analysis per pupil by each of the districts. And you can see that the per pupil costs for some of the schools are relatively high. And it's usually based on their size that causes that anomaly. This is what's called the four accountability functions. So we've left out the capital projects and the debt service. Moving ahead, we're going to look at now the programs. What are the programs? The programs are the objectives for which the resources are expended. There are 6 major programs identified: general education, special ed, LEP, Title I, career and technical, and other programs. Now, in those 6, you can have 99 subcategories in each one of them. And there are a lot of subcategories in some of these. So it breaks it down into further and further detail. Moving to the next one. This is a report from last year as well, the comparative programmatic analysis. It's a little hard to see the legend down there, but the biggest one, of course, is general ed. That's where most of the costs are captured. The reporting dimensions at the educational level, I basically mentioned before that the state, the district, school types, individual schools, and the central office. A little more detail, I move to the next slide. Locations is basically where is the cost occurring? So there, the schools will charge costs directly to schools. They'll also cost or allocate costs from central and goods to pupils and teachers in the school, excuse me. The central sites basically are the Board of Education, district management, and the non-school locations or business operations. And other, as I mentioned before, is the capital and debt. Well, I want to move to the next one. So why do we need to allocate and redistribute costs? Well, here's the reason. Some charge all of their costs to schools. Every single item in that general ledger is at the school level. Some of them charge all of their costs to the central office and administrative, even the teachers. Some of them charge some costs to school and some to central or office using different methodologies of doing it. Most do not allocate shared services. So what we do is we level that playing field by allocating costs so comparisons are possible. Let me move to the next one. What is the allocation methodology that we use? Basically, there's a cost pool. What dollars have we got into this bucket? And secondly, what is the cost driver? What methodology are we going to use to drive those costs into programs, functions, and locations? We're going to match the cost pool using the type of the cost, the function, and the program. So when we're analyzing this, we're looking at all of these parameters together to determine what's the best way to allocate them. Moving to the next one. Here's some examples of allocation metrics. In personnel costs, we will use number of teachers or number of administrators, but it gets actually further down in detail than that. Number of SPED teachers, number of LEP teachers, number of teachers for a particular program. The programmatic ones will be the number of students in the specific program. So I think you were talking about at-risk today. That's one of the programs, and it won't list the students. We don't do work at the student level, but it'll tell us how many of them are in there. The number of teachers in specific programs. On the functional basis, we'll measure things like how many students are riding buses, because all those transportation costs are centralized. We got to get them into the schools. And of course, the number of meals served. Moving to the next one. These are examples of data collected for allocations. It's a long list. This is a partial list. I'm not going to really go through it, but we do gather a lot of information from NDE, who gives us some of the enrollments and things like that. We gather a lot of data from districts, for example, the building square footage, because the buildings need to be maintained. But for the most part, you need to know how big they are to allocate the cost. So we get that kind of level of detail. The allocation metrics are school site specific. And just as I mentioned before, we do not collect and report individual student or staff member information. Why is insight necessary? We have to hit this one a few times because it's active. This is the way, if you look at the first bucket there, you see the budgetary data. This is the way we receive it. 25% of the costs we receive, this is the whole state, are sitting at the school level. 15% are other commitments for the capital and debt service. And 60% of the costs are sitting in the central office. So what do we do? If you look at the second side of it, we basically transform all of those costs that are sitting, not all of them, the costs that are sitting in the central office that need to be in the schools, that's where we move them to. So now you have 5% of your costs are central office and 80% of your costs are schools, which is what you would expect. That's why we have to do this. Once this is done, this will be, like I said, comparable for every one of them. They're all having the same basis of accounting methodology applied to their data. This one kind of moves on its own. Basically, we're transforming, allocating, communicating data that is relevant. It's now more reliable, and it's certainly more comparable. Just to recap at a high level, what is the Insight data all about? It's unbiased and uniform. We don't decide on how the accounting is to be done. We only basically look at what has been done, what data we've been given, and put it into these buckets. We categorize them, we make them comparable, we allocate them, and now they're reliable. So the question really is, do you want to use this data in any way? I personally, and I don't know all of the ins and outs of the law in this thing that you're trying to do. What I do know is this is very reliable data. If you want to get into funding at the programmatic level, this is the data to use. Historical data, okay? Obviously not budget data, it's historical. That's the end of my presentation. I'll be happy to answer any questions.
Does anybody have any questions?
I'm fairly familiar, and I think this provides me some information.
You have any questions?
I guess my only question would be just I understand that there are methodologies to this, and it's kind of unrelated really to this, but so I just submitted back my proofs saying sign off, but I can't verify that they're correct. You know what I mean? I have none of those numbers ever tie back to any number I have.
Right.
And so I feel like if they're, if we're going to kind of in the spirit of transparency with this new funding formula, and clearly I think there's some reporting that's going to have to happen that your product will be able to support. But, again, I think there'll be questions coming back to school districts, and if anyone in the public asks me a question about my Insight data, I can't answer. I have no ability to verify or deny. So I feel like that would be a really strong addition to it. As long as this process is happening, that in some way for school districts to be able to tap into that, to go back and say that this number is getting reported to the legislature and to NDE, and then I can go back and I can somehow say, yes, this is the right number, justify it, and explain it, that sort of thing. And I don't know if that exists, and if it does, I'm not aware of it, but I think that would be really beneficial to the larger process that we're trying to do.
The data is probably sitting in the big data warehouse that we have with the database, which is available to you. We do get questions from NDE throughout the year. That somebody's come in and asked them a question, and they don't know how to answer it, or they don't know where to get the data. And we will pull the information for them to make it a little bit easier, because a relational database can be very confusing, and this one's massive. Your district alone is a million lines.
AJ's point, I think that it's the allocation methodologies is a lot of it, right? So the system itself creates these allocations based on principles and defined terms within the software.
Yes.
That's, I think, where, trying to come up with a way that you can manually recalculate it is hard, but get some, I think that's part of, you're right, I think that it's part of the, transparency piece, which is a huge component. We're going from, 300 or 100 lines of revenue sources to one. That is a huge step forward for us, for being able to show the public where all the money is, right?
Right.
That piece, I think, and it's not an easy ask, because a lot of this is programmatic, right? It's built in. So I think it's a good ask, because I think that will help us in the future, that deciding on how we utilize this system. I know that we're at least the state is moving to using the system from an ESSA reporting requirement perspective, which again, I pushed for, because I have 3 reporting requirements: AB 469, the regular, 4, CAFR, AB 469, Data Insight, and then also ESSA that's coming. So trying to fix it all into one, I think, is key, but trying to figure out how we can make it a little bit more transparent and people can see where it goes, and the defined terms would certainly be helpful.
So let me ask you this very quickly. My understanding is you are allocating costs in some cases. My understanding, Clark already allocates those costs internally in many cases. And so I think it's about understanding, like you say, it is about understanding, but is it the same methodology that's used for every school district? So in other words, if you're not allocating your utility costs right now out to schools, are you using the same metric to allocate those costs at every other school district? So as I know, Clark calculates their utility costs. He can tell you by school what those costs are and submits it directly to Insight that way, their actual costs.
Right.
I know some smaller school districts or other school districts aren't allocating those costs to schools, so Insight's allocating them for them. And is everybody using the same methodology? That's what it sounds like, if you're saying everything is comparable. That would be my own concern, is that we're all on the same, everyone's on the same.
We will apply the same methodology. The issue is, where are those costs in their general ledger system? Are they sitting in the schools? If they're in the schools, we don't need to allocate.
Right.
If they're sitting in the central office, now we need to allocate them to schools as well. Some of it needs to stay in the business side of it.
So his question, if he can't understand where our cost is coming from, he should be able to say, well, those costs are simply allocated based on the number of pupils that are in the school. That school has a high enrollment and are going to get a certain number of costs allocated to it.
Yeah, I think as this moves down the line, because you've raised a good question about looking at your proofs, because you probably had to do it at the 100,000 foot level. Well, those are the numbers I submitted in total. And I think these are right, but I'm not sure. Well, I think the conclusion you probably came to is, I don't see that there's anything wrong,
Right.
materially wrong, right? Yeah, so we need some more transparency as to how it transformed from where it was to where it is. That would be helpful. That's the way Clark does their own. We worked with them for many, many years on getting our systems to mesh together.
Member Casey, do you have any questions? No? Okay. Any other questions from the group?
No, thank you.
No, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay, so the regular commission is starting back at 1:30. We have 2 more presentations, right, from West Ed. Okay, great. Come back. Come back up.
In 2 minutes.
They promised 2 minutes, so.
Okay. All right. So Felicia Brown for the record. We have 2 agenda items, and they're basically just an update on what we're going to tell you in March. The first thing that we'll be going through is, okay, we're good. One thing we're looking at is the level of effort that it will take to get from where you are now in the current state to what is needed for reporting and monitoring for SB 583. And the way we are going about doing that is looking at 5 or 6 LEAs across the state that represent a variety of different configurations of what an LEA might be. We're doing a survey first of basically anyone who touches the financial data to get some basic information about who is involved in grant management, financial management, what systems are used, what systems are working, and then we're going to follow that up with about a half-day site visit at each of those LEAs to really understand what does it look like on the ground, what are the systems, how far away are the people sitting, those kinds of things, and we will analyze that for current state and be able to provide information to you in March about, with some assumptions based on what's in SB 543, what level of effort is going to be required to make a change so that different LEAs of different configurations can implement the required changes.
Okay.
That's that item. And then the last item for in discussing the providing guidance to school districts to support the implementation of the people-centered funding plan. So this will draw directly off of the exemplars and the support and guidance that we closed our last item with. So as the subcommittee, if you all have any questions about that, happy to field those sometime between now and you guys come back together. But primarily focused really on using that stair-step approach, thinking about holding intention or your support and accountability mechanisms to support school districts.
All right, any questions from the members? Board Member Casey? No? Thank you. Then thank you, and thank you very much. I really appreciate that. I will move on then to agenda item number 10. Any future agenda items or discussion regarding future agenda items? As a matter of understanding, I think at some point we will be moving back to where we are simply one commission moving forward. The subcommittee will end as we move forward. So I'm not sure exactly what the timing of that is going to be. Yeah. So, okay, there's any, Member Casey, any future agenda items? Seeing none. All right, item number 11, any public comment? Anybody from the public wishing to speak? Seeing none, this meeting is adjourned.
Bedroom. Going to the bedroom. Yeah, SOS.